Hello, it's Mark Ostrowski from Checkpoint Software, and welcome to the Devops Summit Canada 2021. Again, my name is Mark, and I got about a half an hour's worth of content to run through with you, talking about shifting left, and obviously it's a big part of adding security into the DevOps process. I head up engineering here in North America for Checkpoint. I've been with the company for almost 20 years. And it's amazing to see how so much of our cybersecurity business has transitioned to the cloud. And again, how do we add that security as part of our DevOps process? So that's what my talk will be about. So with that, I'll just get started. So the first thing I want to do is just a little bit of set the stage on who Checkpoint is, really what our differentiators are in the marketplace, just to kind of get things caught up. So again, you see here at Checkpoint, we secure everything. A lot of folks know Checkpoint from our Quantum family of products, enterprise, branch office management, and network security, and some other things that we've been innovating on, like our Maestro platform, which is basically a hardware platform that acts like an agile cloud. Obviously, IoT is a big part of what we do today. All the way on the right-hand side is our Harmony family of products. That's really everything that's end user and branch office from a cloud perspective. What we're here to talk about today is the middle family, which is called Cloudguard, and specifically shifting left. But you can see here we have posture management, network security, workload and serverless security, intelligence and application security. But we're going to dive specifically into this segment and talk a lot about how Cloudguard shift left can really add security and add that into a scenario as part of your CI/CD pipeline or software deployment lifecycle, and deploying that security in a very, very smart and automated way. A lot of people, when they hear about Checkpoint, they think of intelligence. And I want to highlight that in the next couple of slides, and then we'll dive right into shifting left. But you can see here that Checkpoint, again, adding security to everything, which I mentioned in the previous slide. And you see that we've got research, external feeds, we're using artificial intelligence and machine learning to enrich that data. We actually have predictive intelligence, right? Thinking about what's happening in the future, and locating things that perhaps we are predicting, but we're predicting it in a very intelligent way, again, using things like machine learning and artificial intelligence. And because we have this threat cloud that has all this information in it, and we're getting feeds from hundreds of millions of devices, you can just imagine how powerful this cloud can be when you want to provide intelligence to whatever you're doing, whether it's cloud security, network security, or IoT, or end user security. And these numbers on the bottom here, these daily numbers are just staggering. They continue to go up, right? Tens of billions of IOCs per day, 10 trillion logs per day. It's imagine how powerful, this threat cloud is. But what's really important to understand is that this threat cloud has really matured over even just the past 2-3 years. To be able to handle that amount of data, you need to move beyond just, classic machine learning, as you see here, and talk about how we add multiple layers of deep learning, which that basically translates into a neural network. And that capability has really given our customers a much better security stance than even we were even 2 years ago. And you can see here, just by moving towards multiple layers of deep learning, 30% better detection rate, and really important is 90% less false positives. And that's where our customers have got really to know Checkpoint about, is providing the best security intelligence across all of their environment. But specifically today, we'll talk about the cloud. So let's dive right into shifting left, which is the main focus of this presentation, and just do a little bit of a review of DevOps as well as the comms model. So we know that DevOps is this, I'll read this definition here, is a culture of collaboration and ownership with the ability to scale up, out rather than up, with the feedback and be able to provide a mechanism for feedback to improve. But I highlighted here on the left, automate, right? So as part of this comms model, this DevOps culture is not only to have a culture focusing on people and automation and being as lean as possible, measuring everything and then sharing, collaborating, and starting all over. The key here in this automate section is that this concept of constant and continuous delivery and infrastructure as code has really changed the way in which security is imparted when you talk about adding security as part of, again, a software deployment lifecycle. And that's really the goal today, is to talk specifically about how do we add security as code, because we're securing code and we're not doing it in the traditional network security sense, right? And that's really the key of today's talk and how Checkpoint has embarked down this journey for years now. So let's demystify maybe just a little bit about software deployment life cycles. So we know that the SDLC is a process of stages, and we'll go through those stages in the next slide. These phases can include the analysis, design, building, testing, and then obviously the maintenance and support. But one thing that's very interesting about shift left security and just the software deployment lifecycle is a couple of things here is that you want to be able to produce high quality of applications and software in the least amount of time. But an important piece of this is actually the least amount of cost possible. So if you're generating applications in the smallest amount of time, the least amount of cost, like how does security come into play to that? How do you deploy security in a way that doesn't affect the amount of time, it doesn't affect, and it continues to keep the developers in an agile sense of mind when they're deploying their applications and creating their applications, but also how we deploy security in a way that's fiscally responsible. Because again, we want to stick towards these phases in the comms model of collaboration, constant integration, the smallest amount of time possible and the least amount of cost. So how do we fit security into that, and how do we do that in an agile way? And that's really what the goal of today's presentation is. And how do you do that? It's really about leveraging the DevOps process, leveraging the DevOps teams and SecDevOps, and using cloud native tools, APIs, and things of that nature that fall outside of sort of the normal constraints that we typically think of security, where it's a heavy process, non-automated, perhaps network security based, right? And really change the way that we think about things. So let's look at, again, just the Devops Ci Cd stages, just to kind of set the background here. So again, pretty generic, pretty high level, but it's worth reviewing really quickly, right? We have, code, code moves towards, the build stage. And then once we are in the build stage, we obviously want to deploy. But before we deploy, we want to test, right? And that's really where these stages come into play as part of the CI/CD process. So where can we impart security, right? That's a big part of the talk of this particular session. So you can see here, right? We can add security into this dev process by scanning applications code and also scanning the infrastructure as code templates, right? And we'll show you how Checkpoint does this with Cloudguard, but this is one area in which you can impart security in this process, again, in an agile way that's cloud native, right? Leveraging APIs and doing it in a way in which you don't impart that process, right, of quick deployment with low cost. You can also scan container images and Lambda package. Now, this is something that's become very, very important, right? Is that when you deploy code and you're deploying these Lambda packages and these Lambda functions, like how do you put even like zero trust guardrails in place to be sure these functions are only doing what they're supposed to do and only have permissions to do what they need to do. And they don't have these overly permissive credentials that, again, leave areas in which you could have a security incident. And then the container image is a big part of this. Like, how do you look at even a set of containers, and how do you be sure that you're pulling them from maybe a public repo or a specific repository? And how do you be sure these images themselves, even before you actually start to use them, aren't or don't contain malicious code, right? And we know the statistics over the past couple of years of how many just base container images contain malicious code that people are using as part of their process, right? So be able to scan these things, the code, the packages, containers is a big part of imparting DevOps security. And then lastly, you need to be able to perform this live and ad hoc while you're actually ready to deploy and in runtime, right? That's a big part of that, right? So you're assuring, again, along the stage of deploying software, but then doing it actually when things are in runtime and things are actually deployed, and assuring that posture and compliance becomes a big part of that. So just here in the first couple slides, a few slides, we set the stage a little bit about, how the CI/CD process and how you can actually impart security into that in an agile way, in doing that cloud native is really the big takeaway here. So let's just take, one specific industry leader like Gartner and their cloud security vision into this conversation before we dive in specifically how Checkpoint is addressing these problems with our Cloudguard platform. Specifically, we're talking about shifting left. But you see here that, the cloud native application protection platform, that Gartner has built. And if you break these down into these 3 steps, there, a lot of this talks about what we just talked about, even just in the first few slides, right? Assuring good cloud security posture management, right? having a powerful visualization technology so you understand what assets you have, right? And then you really can't, impart security or impart guidelines until you understand what you've got. In the middle here, number 2, right? Having cloud native network capability. So even though we're talking about how do we protect the CI/CD pipeline and how do we interject security into the deployment process, obviously having cloud native network security is a big part of it. So you see things here like WAP, for example, web application API protection is a big thing, denial of service and interaction, some of the traditional things that you see here as well. But really focus on this last pillar here, number 3, right? And this is where a lot of what we're going to talk about today falls into place, right? With solutions that protect server workloads by CI/CD security, scanning codes and images, behavior analysis, runtime protection, and threat hunting. So a lot of that we already talked about, but I haven't really talked much about threat hunting, but that's really where I open up this presentation with talking about Checkpoint's intelligence. It's very difficult to perform threat hunting if you don't have good intelligence on the back end, right? So that's something that obviously is really very native to all Checkpoint products. The other thing too is that I always like to think of threat hunting in 2 different ways. One way is obviously the intelligence-based aspect, but the other as well is how do you threat hunt for misconfiguration, right? And that's something that should be native to any platform that you're looking to adopt as part of your security process, so that you can perhaps maybe look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework and use that framework as a way to hunt through your environment and determine perhaps maybe an S3 bucket was turned off, to be not be encrypted any longer, right? So you can use tools not only to threat hunt the intelligence aspects and everything we do from a malicious code perspective or malicious threat actors, but we also can use threat hunting to actually look for misconfiguration and automate that as well, so that you can be in a preventive manner and not just kind of reporting that something has been misconfigured or if something has gone wrong. So I hope I set the stage fairly well of kind of about this process, about where security may need to be imparted, referencing Gartner here and their cloud security vision as some evidence of even what industry leaders kind of think about where security needs to be deployed. So let's talk and jump right into Cloudguard. Again, that family of products for Checkpoint that's focused on 100% on cloud security. And again, we'll walk through all different aspects of it, but let's focus specifically on, again, the shift left capabilities. So when you look at just this one particular slide, why I like this slide a lot is it breaks down sort of some of the examples of some of the concepts we just talked about. So preventing lateral movement, more of a network microsegmentation aspect of that, but that's obviously a big part of that. Zero trust and continues for how many years now, really be a pillar of security and how you must kind of set that baseline and use the zero trust concepts to be able to just kind of have that good baseline security in place, so that you avoid sort of that cross-contamination, whether it's either accounts or whether it's just network security, so that you're really giving the least amount of access possibly needed. Right? We talked a little bit about workload security, right? Containers and serverless, preventing embedded threats inside of your functions. We talked about even like the repositories potentially being impacted before you even use them in your process. I quickly touched upon WAP and web and API security. But again, hardening the APIs and then inspecting those APIs and preventing things like the OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities, which interesting enough, just were updated, and a lot of the updates for the top 10 threats are now more cloud centric. So it's just more validation that having a very strong cloud security posture is more important now than it's ever been. And then on the very bottom here in blue, again, our focus today is talking about shifting left, right? Moving security again to the left, earlier in the dev process, that's a big part of that. Detecting open source vulnerabilities as it describes here, right? Hardening the code and doing that across a multitude of platforms, right? We're not just talking about a singular platform, and we're talking about Dockers and functions, whether they're Microsoft or AWS. Et cetera, et cetera. You see here Kubernetes, from a container perspective. So what does that look like when you actually think about deploying security as part of the process, right? So first of all, you kind of have to think about it as having a seamless integration with all CI/CD pipelines. So on the very, very bottom here, You can see having a checkpoint Cloudguard shift left binary Docker to be used with a lot of different CI servers as a plugin, right? Jenkins, AWS, Circle CI, GitLab, Azure DevOps, and so forth and so on. And really, what this specific particular slide really depicts is that, right? You view the vulnerability scanning during the process. You can detect these over permissive functions. You can do this in an automated runtime protection scenario, and then you have auto remediation as part of that. So you can see here as the code moves their way through the pipeline, right? Using a source code scan from Cloudguard, imaging, using a Docker image scanning capability as it moves into, say, perhaps a containerized scenario, or even like a template form in Terraform, right? And that's what gives you these capabilities of being able to impart that security very, very early in the process, and assure the things that we just mentioned, right? Make sure that you don't have a container that has that came from a compromised repository, being sure that some of the source code is not overly permissive, things of that nature, and not just not just telling you that the code may be malicious or overly permissive, but actually giving that remediation and giving those suggestions up front, right? That's what gives you that agile aspect that we're looking for. Again, doing this in a way that's quick, but also low cost, right? We don't want something that's too heavy, then that's not cloud native. So everything we're talking about here is cloud native, done in a quick fashion, immediate feedback to the developer, as you move through this. So here's, an example of a shift left infrastructure as code assessment. So you can see here, this is ensuring, that, the AWS CIS Foundations benchmarks, the CIS benchmarks are being adhered to. And we're doing this in a real-time way. You can see we're using this with the shift left CLI, but you can see here it really blocks down and says, hey, there's a critical area of non-compliance, right? Assuring that the SSM documents are not publicly exposed, right? It actually gives you a breakdown of what that would look like if you want to do a further search out through the environment. And you can see below this is even a high one, right? So ensuring AWS config is enabled in all regions. So again, using an automated tool to be able to do this assessment, and then again, using it with known compliance reporting, right? So CIS Foundations and CIS benchmarks is a known, trusted, compliance framework, and be able to take that framework and apply it to a thing like a Terraform, playbook, and building that into the process is a big part of this. So let's break down a little bit about how Cloudguard and shift left technology falls into all the different areas that we just kind of talked about, right? So CSPM are the posture management aspects. So you can do the scanning as code, you can do it at the commit point, and you can see down on the deployment phase, all the way on the right-hand side, right? Understand where those assets are, understanding the behavior analytics, getting access into the access role, the roles, and the permissive aspects of that. So you're doing it through the entire process, not just in the beginning and not just during runtime, but through the entire process. The workload protection aspects, the second one down here, right? Again, validating and scanning the code, doing third-party library scans, doing that through the commit phase, ensuring that the images during the build part of the process are non-malicious or coming from the correct repositories. Again, and then during deployment, you see all these things, right? You see the Kubernetes right time assurance and the intrusion detection and VM protection, the container runtime protection. All these things are happening again during the deployment phase while they're running, and you're ensuring that the compliance and governance and there's no violations in place is a big part of that. And then, of course, right in the bottom, right, the network security aspects, right, mostly on the deployment phase, because we're not talking about code at this point, because things are actually on the network themselves. And then the very, very bottom here, much right in the wheelhouse of what we're talking about, right, having the plugins from a code perspective, right, using a CLI tool like I just mentioned before to do that integration as things are being developed, and doing that all the way through the deployment, right? So on the very bottom here, you have the risk and the attack vectors. Very much what we talked about. We talked about, vulnerable code and images and more overly permissive functions. We talked about the vulnerability, the vulnerable code. We've talked about improper behavior, but all these things come into play. This is exactly what shift left security does for Checkpoint Cloudguard. So kind of in closing here, as I kind of wrap up, traditional security models can't keep up with application-centric threat models, right? If we look at the traditional way in which security is deployed, right, we won't be able to keep up with all the issues that could be popping up. And again, we need to be cloud native. We need to be able to do this in an agile way, right? So traditional security models also can't remediate these vulnerabilities and malicious files. We're talking more about just blocking something on the network, right? We're talking about integrating as part of the process and being able to do that through the entire build process and giving that feedback to the developer so that the developer knows, hey, maybe I shouldn't have used a third-party module because it's known to be malicious, right? Giving that feedback, something that obviously traditional models can't do. Again, traditional security is reactive, right? It's signature-based. This approach has to change and has to evolve. And we talk a lot about threat modeling at Checkpoint and how threat modeling has really changed the DevOps process and really changed the process in which applications getting rolled out, and how threat modeling fits into that whole process, understanding how and who needs to be involved, as well as once code is actually written, having the correct vulnerability assessments, again, using cloud native tools to be sure that application is deployed in the most safe way. So when you lead, right, with DevOps best practices, these are all the things that you can come to expect. And I've highlighted one here in bold, right, that now that infrastructure is code, security needs to be code. This is very, very important, but relatively obvious thing, but certainly needs to be said. We need to be able to track the security issues, right? Automate these security processes, detect the known vulnerabilities during the pipeline, so that why wouldn't you remove something you already know needs to be removed because it's malicious nature of it, right? And then inject failure into the process. This is a really key point as well, right? Is that the process needs to be tested. So injecting failure into that is a big part of that, to make sure that the security codes themselves are hardened and that you don't miss something as things get developed and released. Again, that's a big part of how application development has changed, of the amount of time and how quickly things get rolled out into production. You make sure that you're constantly checking the system itself. So here at Checkpoint, our cloud security teams, we'll feel like shifting left, and the Cloudguard shift left is the way to remember these problems. Static security, application security testing, and dynamic application security testing, right? So something that's signature based is part of that, but moving beyond that and understanding how to actually test beyond signatures and be able to do things in real time is a big part of what DAST is. Again, reviewing really quickly the container scans, the compliance scans, and the dependency scans. These are all things that should happen very, very early in the process, in the test process, and then as you move your way through runtime. So it's a great QR code here that you could scan. You can really get a big response back, with a few documents around our innovation, and cloud native security is right on the top of one of these documents. And you really can understand not only our shift left capabilities, but our posture management, our application security, our cloud intelligence, and our threat hunting capabilities, as well as network security. So I certainly, definitely, if you get a chance, do a quick QR code scan here, and you can pull down all this great information. So in summary, as I wrap up here, again, I want to thank you for spending, just about a half an hour with me. But we want to make sure we impart better security in a simple way, in a single architecture. And that's a big part of it. I didn't talk too much about this, but as you see here below, these are the icons that we talked about right off in the beginning, where you've got their cloud components, you've got your end user access and branch office capabilities, your network security capabilities. And you see here that Infinity logo here is really that one architecture, that one Checkpoint architecture that takes care of security across all these different disciplines. So with that, again, have a great rest of the conference, and talk to you soon.